Hey guys, I've got to take a little bit of time off to deal with some important things on the home front. And our team here at Pelican Plus is posting my greatest hits, let's call them, of some older videos that I've done, which may be new to you if you haven't seen them before. For those of you who are watching this on Substack and you are a paid subscriber, make sure that you click down underneath for the post explaining how to migrate over to Pelican Plus. And if you're someone who's never subscribed before, now's as good a time as any. There's a link down there for you as well. All right, enjoy the show. Good day, my friends. We're back with another edition of our book study. We're studying Have Uncrowned Him by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. So timely given this season of political elections and upheaval and so forth. Recently, we saw the insanity of the Olympic opening, which, of course, was the result of liberalism. France is infamously a country that adopted the most sort of extreme form of anti-Catholic liberalism and so forth. The most extreme form that's not communism in the explicit sense. We'll go into how liberalism really is communism. Communism is liberalism, but there are slight distinctions in some ways without a difference. But at least in name, they're called different things. In any event, today we're going through chapters 5 and 6. So get your copies of the book out. If you don't have a copy of the book, that's fine. I'll, of course, show it on the screen. I'm not going to read every single word as usual, but I'm going to go through the most important points. Again, I was away for a few days, traveling and so forth, just getting home, getting back to life with the kiddos, helping the wife and so forth. So I missed last week, but I promise I'll be on schedule from here on out. So in any event, let's get right into the book. Now, by the way, I should say, if you're listening to the free preview or watching the free preview on Substack, then you're going to want to sign up for the rest of the episode. And you can check out all the episodes on the Substack. Just scroll down, you'll find them. They all have the same thumbnail, the same image on the thumbnail, different titles, but same image, so you know exactly what it is. It's easy to find. Okay, let's bring up the book. So, just going to click the right button here. All right, so chapter 5 is called Beneficial Constraints. And this is a quote from St. Augustine that begins it. It says, "Do not consider that you are constrained, but to what you are constrained, if it is to the good or to the evil." Now, this question of constraints, meaning what are you restrained from doing? What are you restricted from doing? This is a perennial discussion in the practical sense about what role the government should have in restraining you. I've always made it very clear that my political leanings are very limited government. To be honest, if you look back to the Middle Ages and the time of the greatest Catholic kingdoms in Christendom and so forth, yes, the governments were very strong, but the things that federal governments at least did were very minimal in the daily life of citizens. And the things that local governments did were much more minimal than people can kind of conceive of. Even many Catholics have fallen into the sort of myths against the church that during the time of Catholic and Christian kings, there was this authoritarian power that they had over the citizens. But that's not true. In fact, I was having this long discussion during COVID with people about sort of libertarianism versus integralism and all these kinds of things as a response to the COVID insanity. And one of the things I tried to hammer home was that when you actually look at the way that Christendom governance worked, in a sense, many things were actually private that today we would call public services. So militaries, for example, there may have been certain taxes paid in a selective sense towards a particular national defense effort or something like that. But if you look at how armies were funded, they were almost always funded by the sovereign himself, and the king himself had to have his own budget, and that budget had to be made doing commerce, and the commerce was what funded his regime, funded his government. Those who were elected to various types of councils as lords and senators and so forth, depending on the structure of the particular kingdom, they themselves had to be self-made men. Usually they were from families of aristocracy or wealth or nobility, and they didn't need the money. It was something that they did out of duty. It's interesting. When we actually look back on the time of Christendom, it's completely opposite to what the myths are about how people think it was. It was, yes, there were strong governmental activities depending on the circumstance, but they were very minimal compared to now. The primary role of the federal or the national, let's call them, sovereigns and so forth, were really to establish the rights of the religion, the Catholic faith, to concern themselves with matters that were sort of interregional, things that had to have some sort of arbitration outside of the local sectors, and then, of course, matters of defense and national war efforts and so forth. And that was the majority of it. There were no income taxes. There weren't, carbon taxes or whatever. There was no inflation because the monetary system was very different. That's a whole other conversation that requires a lot more in-depth understanding to understand how monetary theory works. And in any event, the constraints have always been there. But the question is where should the restraints come from? Should they come from a particular law? Or should the law only be reserved to punish what is clearly criminal behavior? There are pros and cons to different sides of the argument. For example, with sexual morality. In the past, where things like sodomy and so forth were illegal, if you actually look into the records, very rarely were they ever enforced. But it was known that it was illegal. And what I mean by enforced was, obviously, no one has the resources to police people's private homes and see what sort of sins they're doing. That's obviously not something practical, or it's kind of absurd. Just from a practical perspective, being able to do it, how can you do that without becoming a tyrannical regime yourself? I mean, it's kind of nonsense to think you could even really do it. But nonetheless, the fact that it was illegal meant that there could be no public promotion of it. There could be no explanation of it to the public. There could be no grooming. There could be no public activity associated with it. And like all sins, like prostitution, like drug use, various types of gambling and so forth, it just stayed something that would happen in certain corners. And one of those unfortunate realities, the fall of fallen human nature and people's disordered psychological realities, depending on their experiences in life. And it remained outside of the public consciousness and didn't spread. Whereas in our society, we see a legalization, so to speak, but not only that, we see a promotion of it. And then, of course, we see that makes a lot of converts. So there is a real utility in making certain moral things illegal. Nonetheless, the enforcement of them is in some ways more ceremonial. There were certain people punished for certain crimes against various commandments that had to do with strict sexual morality, but those were almost made as something like an example. You know, that you did this in public, therefore you're going to prison. And it sort of let this be known that we're not going to do this here. So pros and cons to the way in which you enforce things. I would say that making certain things illegal, even if the enforcement of it's going to be somewhat ceremonial, it still has a major effect. People do look to the law for a lot of validity and legitimacy in their actions. That's just how we are. And we're going to go through why as we go through these chapters. But St. Augustine has a great quote where he says, don't think about essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but don't think about what you're restrained from, but what you're restrained to. We are all attached. We all have a yoke. Christ talks about this in the gospel, put on my yoke. We all have a yoke. We're all attached to something. There is always some sort of necessary, attachment or link to something that we can't really escape from because of the fact that we have to exist in this temporal realm where there is time and space, and there are things that have limits and whatnot, and we have to participate in those things. So from the basic moral order, there must be restraints. Of course there must be. But what does this mean with the notion of liberalism in politics? Well, let's go back to this book here. So he has this long quote here from Cardinal Below. And I'm going to read some of it. And he says, the fundamental principle of liberalism is the freedom from all coercion, whatever it may be, not only from that which is carried out by violence and which aims only at external acts, but also from the coercion which proceeds from the fear of laws and penalties, from social dependencies and necessities, in a word, from the ties of every nature which prevent man from acting according to his natural inclinations. For the liberals, the individual liberty is the good par excellence, the fundamental inviolable good to which everything should yield, except perhaps what is required for the purely material order of the city. Liberty is the good to which all the rest is subordinated. It is the necessary foundation of all social construction. And he adds, the principle of liberalism is absurd, against nature, and visionary. What does he mean by visionary? Well, it's visionary in the sense that it's fantastical. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. It's absurd in that it denies human nature. And he also said that it is against nature. Exactly. Well, why is it absurd? Well, it's absurd because it can't happen. Even the notion of liberty unqualified. Freedom is the first precept. We hear this a lot in modern discourse. During the COVID thing, it was very annoying because obviously what was done was wrong. But the response was largely, obviously the Catholic Church, vast majority of the bishops around the world and even the Pope failed miserably to deal with it. They were as bad as the communists in many cases. So really the main objections, the main resistance came from sort of the freedom fighter 1776, human rights crowd. A lot of great points they had and everything, but why was the COVID regime wrong? Well, because I'm a free man. Well, free for what? What does the freedom mean? The COVID regime was wrong, not because of the principle of liberty, but because it was based in nonsense. It was against nature. It was imprudent. It was tyrannical and coercive. It was wrong because it was all of the information that undergirded it was false, because it was dangerous, because it harmed the inner workings of families. It was wrong for a lot of reasons. And all of those things were definitely restrictions on particular liberties. But liberty per se isn't why it was wrong. Because the thing about that is you saw a lot of these sort of left-wing libertarians who have liberty as their first principle saying, hey, companies are private companies. They can have vaccine mandates if they want. The airplanes are private companies. They can say you can't fly if they want, And so you see that the principle only goes so far, because if liberty just basically means I'm in control of a thing and I can do whatever I want with the thing if it's mine, you get into this realm where you're going to have this interaction with the public and it's going to be a menace to society if that's the fundamental principle. So even the notion of liberty has to be qualified. What do we mean by liberty as Catholics? We mean the freedom to do what we must. And Pope Leo XIII talks about this in his various encyclicals on liberty. And yes, there is a true liberty. There is a true Catholic liberty. It's the freedom to do what you must do. It's a freedom to, it is the right, it's like he talks about in Rerum Novarum, it's our rights and duties. All of your rights, all of your freedoms are associated with your duties. You have the right to work because you have the duty to support your family. You have the right to travel because you have the duty to go places. You have the right to assemble with other human beings because you must live in society, and so on and so forth. But it's not unadulterated liberty that's the principle. It's the liberty tied to the obligation. As St. Augustine says, you do have restraint. You are restrained to things. You are constrained to things. But what are those things? That's the point. And that's the problem with liberalism. The main problem is that it's the ultimate freedom of man to be free from all coercion whatsoever, both moral and civil, which is against his nature because man is a spiritual animal and therefore he has constraints that he must follow in order to save his soul. And that's kind of the crux of it. If we go back to the book here, the next page, Archbishop Lefebvre has this subsection called The Liberal Principle is Absurd. And he writes, the liberal principle is absurd. Incipit ad ab absurdo. It begins in absurdity by pretending that the principal good of man is the absence of every tie capable of hampering or restraining liberty, which is what I've just explained. And he says the principal good of man indeed should not be considered as an end, that which is desired in itself. Now liberty of action is only a means, is only a faculty that can permit man to acquire a good. It is therefore completely relative to the use that one makes of it. Good if it is for the good, bad if it is for the evil. It is therefore not an end in itself. It is certainly not the principal good of man. And he has another citation on the other side of the page that I've highlighted here And he says, I intervened myself several times at Vatican II to protest against the liberal concept of liberty, which was being applied to religious freedom, an idea according to which liberty would be defined as an exemption from all constraint. And that's what it does say in Vatican II, by the way. There's a real problem there. This is what I declared then, and I highlighted the second part. The declaration against constraint in number 28 is ambiguous and in certain aspects false. What would happen indeed to the paternal authority of the fathers of Christian families over their children, to the authority of the teachers in the Christian schools, to the authority of the church over apostates, heretics, and schismatics, to the authority of the heads of Catholic states over false religions, which bring with them immorality, rationalism, etc. So let's just read that again, because this is kind of at the heart of the problems in our society today. We're dealing with all of them. What would happen to the paternal authority of the fathers of Christian families over their children? That right there is something that we are seeing in spades. In the most extreme senses, you see states enacting insane laws like, your kids can go get contraception and puberty blockers and whatever to change their, supposedly change their genders, etc., without your permission, because this is following the principle of liberty. The child is born free, and the parents are merely constraints that work against the sort of animal instincts that are ingrained into the child. And really, the problem with liberalism in many ways is that it attaches itself to something like a fatalist determinism. So if you look into some of and this is why our liberal society loves Eastern religions. Our liberal society loves sort of these Hallmark card version or fortune cookie prophecy versions of Hinduism and Buddhism. Why? Because those religions are determinist. They view the nature of reality as cyclical. They're ultimately pantheist. You are Atman as part of Brahman. And there's sort of this passage that you go through during this stage until the point where the universe reaches basically its omega point, which is what Teilhard de Chardin, that arch heretic, talked about. And essentially along the way, you pass through these certain stages that are a result of what has happened since your reincarnation. So if you talk to people who spend time in India, real India, not like tourist version, look at me, I'm at an ashram and I have a picture on TikTok or Instagram and I'm so cool, but real India, the reason why so many people leave India. I was talking to Father Summers, who is the district superior for Asia for the Society of St. Pius X, and he was at my house last year. We had a long conversation. And he also did some presentations at our parish and so forth. And, he spent a lot of time in India. He was actually placed there for the first 3 or 4 years of his priesthood and then eventually a couple other assignments and becomes the superior of Asia itself. He spent a lot of time there. And he said, to this day, you will walk down the street and you will see people basically dying of starvation or disease or injuries or even old age, basically just lying on the side of the road. And people just walk over them. That still happens today. And why is that? Because it's determinist. Because they are experiencing exactly what they must experience because things have been set in motion since the beginning and are unchangeable. And therefore, there is nothing you can do to interrupt that process. And if you do intervene to do something to interrupt that process, you're actually working against sort of the karmic trajectory of the universe and their spiritual journey that they must be on in order to be in accord with reality. That's kind of how they deal with it. This is why Catholicism is so suppressed in India, because it's diametrically opposed to the Eastern system. 100% Buddhism, in some cases, is less... Buddhism is a little different in the sense that they obviously follow this sort of reincarnation-ish mentality, and it's very linked to Hinduism. I mean, they kind of come out of the same pantheon of Eastern fatalisms. However, the Buddhists do have more of an understanding of sort of intentional agency in that you can sort of escape that grind by deciding to not desire the things of the world, which sort of gives you the freedom from attachments to having to exist, basically. And you kind of go through this process of self-annihilation. So they would be, in a sense, more willing to let's say, try to intervene, but the intervention from a Buddhist perspective would be more of, yes, this is all terrible and wicked and everyone's dying and starving and whatever. But it's not that we're going to change society. It's that I'm going to help you come out of it so you don't even consider yourself a part of it to begin with. And therefore, you don't have to suffer the consequences of it because they're all sort of an illusion. And really, you're supposed to have this self-annihilation to be one with the oneness and blah, 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 blah. Liberals love this. You notice that our liberal society has gotten rid of Christianity, which is purely, it is unadulteratedly filled with free will, consequences of actions, intervention in lives and things like that for reasons of morality and charity and so forth, for a purpose of attaining your final end of being saved. But as we've rejected that, people have gone to these Eastern things because it's a lot easier for them. You know, this is why modern society, modern liberal society is such a, it's a monstrosity. It's a modern post-Christian Western society is a philosophical monstrosity. It's a chimera. If you know what a chimera is, it's this combination of two things that can't survive if they're made into one thing. They try to do this with animals and things like that, with embryos and whatnot, and it becomes these monstrous things that just die. It's a chimera because on the one hand, you have, you know, the classic, you know, liberal university girl student who's all like, I'm all into yoga and I'm so big on green tea and soy stuff and I'm so spiritual, blah, 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 blah. And like, I don't believe in, you know, all of this oppression and patriarchy and all these Christian things, basically. But at the same time, they demand that they be respected. They demand that they have rights. They demand that they get to have a seat at the table because there's an inherent value that they have, which must be acknowledged. And if you don't, you're a bigot. They're neither Christians nor Hindus. They're like this monstrous combination of the most caricatured versions of both. What we would call human rights, which is a silly term at times because it's used for anything, but generally speaking, what we would call human rights, you know, this notion that you actually have dignity and you can't be assaulted and whatever for arbitrary reasons and so forth, you know, these sort of basics of what it means to have general protections against evil. This is Christian. It's not Eastern, it's Christian. So they want that, but because they imbibe this, you know, I'm basically a goddess, which is what you are if you're Eastern because you're one with the ultimate and there is no distinction between you and him. It makes you into a god, essentially, in the small g sense. But because they're a goddess, they should not only have rights, but they should have the most rights. They should have the bestest of rights, and they should have more rights than anyone who disagrees with them. And this is the problem with our society, and this is liberalism. This is the main issue. And another part here in this paragraph that I've highlighted, and he says, what would happen to the authority of the teachers in the Christian schools? Well, I can tell you, as a former teacher in a Catholic school, liberalism reigned and so forth. Sorry, I have allergies if you hear me sniffing. My allergies are always real bad till like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're fine. I'm recording this at 10 a.m., but I was teaching in a Catholic school, teaching the catechism, teaching the Bible, teaching what was actually in the curriculum, because it used both of those as sources. And I had no freedom to do so. I had ultimately no rights, and they coerced me against it to the point where I either had to basically go against my conscience or resign, and I chose to resign. And I mean conscience in the good sense of the formed conscience, knowing that I couldn't insult God by watering down his truth. And then I was disciplined by the provincial governing body of teacher certifications in the province for basically being a bigot, meaning I taught the students that there were two genders and so forth. And that is liberalism. There is no authority of Christian teachers in their schools. There's no authority. The church has no rights in a liberal society. I was told by the government representative that my opinions, this was a direct quote, my opinions supported by Catholic doctrine constituted abuse of my students. So in a liberal society, Catholic teaching is abusive. That's the logic of liberalism. Let's go to the next page. So here's this portion where he talks about the modern spirit and liberalism. Just going to move this thing over there so you can see if you're watching. And this is a citation. And actually, it's funny enough, this is actually found in Suarez, who was otherwise an amazing theologian. But this kind of edging towards liberalism found its way into some of the great late scholastics. And this is a quote from Suarez. I am free to the extent that there is no law that comes along to limit me. That's true in the sense of if what you mean is moral law. So, for example, if you want to go walk through a field, or if you want to walk down the sidewalk, or if you want to choose vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream or whatever. I mean, in the sense of the psychological liberty, in the sense you have your free will, as long as there is no impediment that is legitimate, then yes, you are free. But when this is taken to the civil sphere, this basically becomes, I'm free because I'm not being told I can't, which is really license and not liberty. The next line I've highlighted here, a world, and this is the point of the real end of freedom and liberty, a world entirely ordered towards the sovereign good gives place to a new world centered on man, preoccupied with man's prerogatives, his rights, his liberty. So our society is centered on man, preoccupied with man's prerogatives, his rights, his liberty. This is why the Novus Ordo is liberalism. The Novus Ordo is, you got to read Dr. K's book, Once and Future Roman Rite. And he says that technically speaking, the Novus Ordo does contain a reference to the sacrificial nature of the Mass. It's not clear, but it is officially there, which makes it not in the strictest sense a heretical rite, in the sense that it does contain enough to make the consecration valid and so forth. However, we could say it's an erroneous rite. Heresy and error are different. We could say that it's impossible to avoid heresy or error through the continual interaction with it. And this is why. Don't take my word for it. I'm not going to bring up the passage right here. Actually, you know what? I will, just to show you. 1 second. So here is selections of Paul VI's, basically, the launch party for the Novus Ordo. And I guess it's important to read the paragraph before that. And he's talking about the vernacular. Why is it going to be in the vernacular? So for all those of you who say the Novus Ordo was written in Latin, it wasn't meant to be in the vernacular. That's not true according to the Pope who made the thing. So you're going to have to figure that out. And he says the introduction of the vernacular will certainly be, it's right here, I'll highlight it for you, will certainly be a great sacrifice for those who know the beauty, the power, and the expressive sacrality of Latin. So which is interesting there, is he's saying Latin does have sacrality, and he's saying that the other languages don't. So there's literally an intentional taking away of the sacred from the Mass. So take that as you will. We are parting with the speech of the Christian centuries. We are becoming like profane intruders in the literary preserve of sacred utterance. We will lose a great part of that stupendous and incomparable artistic and spiritual thing, the Gregorian chant. We have reason indeed for regret, reason almost for bewilderment. What can we put in the place of that language of the angels? We are giving up something of priceless worth, but why? What is more precious than these loftiest of our church's values? Isn't that amazing? Just as a side note here, this is what the sedevacantist and the modernists both fail on. They talk about it as if you don't believe that the Mass promulgated by the Pope, or I guess published by the Pope, there's dubious laicity to it. That's another conversation for another day. But the promulgation of the liturgy, so-called, if you don't think it's great and you have a problem with it, there's something wrong with you, and you have pride or something. Actually, no, because the Pope who wrote the thing or instructed the thing said we're losing a ton of great things and it's going to be a disaster. That's what he said. But there's a greater reason. And what is that reason? Let's go through it. He says the answer will seem banal, prosaic, yet it is a good answer because it is human. because it is apostolic. So we're going to destroy the liturgy, but there is a good answer because it's a human answer first, and then it's an apostolic answer second. So it's based on the rights of man first, then the deposit of faith. So man before faith. Understanding of prayer is worth more than the silken garments in which it is royally dressed. Participation by the people is worth more, particularly participation by modern people, which is different than regular people, apparently. So fond of plain language, which is easily understood and converted into everyday speech. So the new Mass is liberalism because it's about what man wants for how he views his reality versus how God has instructed man to live in reality. The new Mass is liberalism. This is why I avoid it at all costs. It's liberalism. The new Mass cannot but inspire heresy in the long term, and you have to work very hard not to be inspired by it, according to the Pope. So take it as you will. All right, the next chapter, Necessary Inequalities. This is a wonderful chapter. I have more highlights in this one. The reason why this is a wonderful chapter is because I think this chapter speaks to people very naturally. I think pretty much everyone who is some sort of conservative politically gets this. There are inequalities that are baked into the cake. There are inequalities in heaven in the sense that there's a hierarchy, in the sense that we're never going to be equal with God because we're not God. And that's a good thing. Getting rid of inequalities in an arbitrary sense always leads to death and destruction and murder and genocide. But besides that, but most importantly, leads to spiritual death. Because if you really want a full equality, I mean, you're going to have to associate yourself with God. And that's satanic. That's Luciferian. Egalitarianism is Luciferian. It's satanic. It's the original sin. You know, hey, to heck with this God fella and what he's telling you. You can become like gods. It's the same thing. So let's go to the chapter. So the first quote is from Charles Maurras. It says, nature goes forward with actions of authority and inequality, contradicting at a right angle the odd liberal and democratic hypothesis. Archbishop Lefebvre quotes Cardinal Below about liberalism. It is contrary to nature in that it pretends that everything should give way to the good of individual liberty, that social necessities have multiplied the obstacles to this liberty, and that the ideal regime for man is that in which the law of pure and perfect individualism would reign. Now the author adds, this individualism is absolutely contrary to human nature. So here's the amazing thing. Liberalism cuts itself off at the root at the very beginning. It's self-contradictory at the beginning because liberalism is this notion that everyone should basically be allowed to just exist and there should be nothing done to them to stop them from being what they want to be. So what does a liberal do? He comes in and controls everybody to make sure that can happen. It makes no sense. You're not free because there are inequalities. Let me come in and change all of everything in your society to make sure you're free. It's stupid. Liberalism is a mental illness. It's a cancer of the mind. It's ridiculous. He goes on to say, Archbishop Lefebvre does, quoting citing the notions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a progenitor of this liberalism. They were always perverts, by the way. Liberals were always perverts. All of these liberal revolutionaries were always perverts. Which is why we shouldn't be surprised that when we see, the Olympic stuff and tranny story hour or whatever, it's always perversion. Always. It's impossible. The thing they fight for the most is perversion. And they believe that the liberals, the origin of their misfortunes and of inequality resides in the introduction of private property, which engendered rivalries, a state of war of all against all. I made a note there for myself. What does that sound like? Liberalism is communism. The note's there on the screen. I highlighted for you. Liberalism is communism. By their very own admissions, the problem with society is we have private property. Private property. Okay? Get rid of the private property so you can all be equal. What's that called? Communism. Duh. I'll make this bigger here. Sorry. That's better. Okay, back to it. So, this next page. He says the notion of this liberal equality is refuted by Thomas Aquinas, who demonstrates that the social nature of man by bringing into evidence the fact that man is the animal most devoid of natural means of subsisting. I apologize, these allergies. In an autonomous manner when he comes into the world, and this other fact that men at the adult age cannot satisfy all their needs alone. Therefore, they have to help one another. So, what is he saying here? This idea that society stops your ability to thrive and be, and to be free is actually the opposite of reality. Human beings are the most dependent creatures by design. We're the only animals that come out in a state of prolonged total dependency. Even our supposed closest ancestors or relatives or whatever in the primates. I don't believe they're our ancestors, but you know what I'm saying. Yes, they're dependent on their mom, but they can already walk and hang on to things and hold on and, they're way further ahead than we are. Human beings are completely dependent. And we remain that way. And the liberals remain that way. Liberals depend on society for them to change society, right? Liberals depend on coercion by the state in order to free people from themselves. They're a bunch of idiots. He continues, and he quotes here Leo XIII about liberalism and the origin of political power. Leo XIII says, "The important error of these philosophies consists in not seeing what is nevertheless obvious. It is that men do not constitute an uncivilized and solitary race. It is that before any resolution of their will, their natural condition is to live in society." It's true. We don't make that decision. It's just instinct. We know we have to. You watch those shows where people live off the grid or whatever. And I'm not throwing shade or hating on anybody who wants to be less dependent on the government. Goodness knows I can't stand the government in 99% of the cases. However, you watch these reality shows, so-and-so lives off the grid in Alaska, except every 3 weeks he goes into town to get a bunch of propane. No one really lives off the grid in the fullest sense. I mean, the only way to live off the grid in the fullest sense is basically to go off into the woods and live like a subsistence hunter or something like that. But then once you invite children and stuff into the mix, you have a wife, you're going to come to this position where there's some sort of illness or injury or whatever. Your wife's going to experience death in childbirth. These things happen. And you have to depend on someone with an expertise who's in society, a doctor or whatever, a healer of some sort, to help you. I mean, you have to be dependent on people in society. You just can't avoid it. And the family is a society. You're born into a society. If you want to find, liberalism is ultimately a rejection of the authorities, of every authority, ultimately. Again, why you see liberal politicians advocating for the anarchistic destruction of civilization, because they hate society, they hate authority. But, the most poorly behaved children alive are the children of liberal parents. I know none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. But one of the things you realize when you hang around with faithful Catholics, whether they're conservative in the sort of Novus Ordo sense, but very conservative in their morals and values, or traditionalists, their kids are always head and shoulders above regular kids. This is not a slight to the kids. It's their parents' fault. But that's just always the way it is. Because there's authority. Because real Catholics believe in this thing called original sin. And they recognize that children, when they're left to their own devices, will become Lord of the Flies. You know, if you've ever spent time around a Catholic boarding school with boys, and you see what they get up to when they have free time, you realize Lord of the Flies is exactly correct. Now, obviously, it doesn't get that bad because there are adults around and things, but when teenage boys are allowed to have sort of the freedom to govern themselves with others, it's a disaster, which is why you have to have authority. And this is the section here we'll continue, of visionary equality. So this notion that liberalism is a visionary thing. So again, what does it mean by visionary? It means it doesn't exist. It's an imagination. It's a vision. Cardinal Below says, in the first place, this is about visionary egalitarianism. In the first place, because it does not agree in any way with reality. It supposes at the origin of all society an initial pact. Where did one see this? It supposes the free entry of each one into society. That is even stronger. It assumes that all men are tailored on exactly the same model, are exactly equal, which is the abstract man, millions of times reproduced without features of individuality. Where is he? This man doesn't exist. This idea of the social contract or social compact, this is something that you find trumpeted by conservative political commentators. You know, they'll say, oh, the heart of America is the social contract. This is a fabrication. Society does not start with a contract. It starts with nature. You are by nature in a society, and you cannot avoid it. He goes on to something from Pope Pius VI. And this is a condemnation of the declarations of the rights of man by the French revolutionary government. And he says, where is then this liberty of thought and action that the National Assembly grants to social man as an indefeasible right of nature? Is not this visionary right contrary to the rights of the Supreme Creator, to whom we owe our existence and all that we possess? So, the notion that you have freedom of, where is it? Why am I missing it here? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, liberty of thought and action. Excuse me, it's at the beginning. Freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the freedom. These things are condemned by the church. And they were for like 200 years. That is a consistency of the ordinary magisterium of the popes. That's infallible. That's how it works. Pope Pius VI is telling us this is against the Creator. And it's against the rights of the Creator. Anyway. Furthermore, can it be ignored that man has not been created for himself alone, but in order to be useful to his fellow creatures? For such is the weakness of human nature that to preserve themselves, men need the mutual help of one another. And that is why men have received from God reason and the use of words, to put them into a state of claiming the assistance of other people and of helping in their turn those who implore their support. It is therefore nature itself that has brought men together and has gathered them in society. And he continues, he says, Moreover, since the use that man must make of his reason consists essentially in recognizing his sovereign progenitor, in honoring him, in admiring him, in yielding to him all of his person and all of his being, since from his childhood he has to be subject to those who have superiority of age over him, to let himself be governed and instructed in lessons, to learn from them to regulate his life according to the laws of reason, of society, and of religion. Therefore, this equality, this liberty that are so vaunted are for him, from the moment of his birth, only vain fancies and words empty of meaning. That's a very strong statement. So the notion of freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, I get to say what I want, I get to believe what I want, I get to do what I want, as long as it's not hurting anybody, blah, 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 blah. This is condemned in the strongest terms by popes for 200 years. I mean, that's kind of a big deal. He adds from Pope Leo here, he says, in his turn, condemns the liberal principle of the equality of men taken up by the socialists. Liberalism is socialism. And you see here on this side of the page, he has other quotes here. I won't read the whole thing. But Archbishop Lefebvre says, it appears to me that these texts clearly show the total unrealism of the fundamental principle of liberalism, liberty, equality. It is on the contrary an undeniable fact of nature that the individual at any stage of his life is precisely not an interchangeable individual, but he is a member that is at the outset a part of a body set up without his having a word to say about it. Within this body, besides, he is subject to necessary and beneficial constraints. In this body, finally, he will discover the place that corresponds to his natural or acquired talents, as well as to his supernatural gifts, being subject there also to hierarchies and to inequalities that are still very beneficial. Thus has God devised it, a God of order and not of disorder. And I have here a note. This is a key distinction between atomized individualism and pantheistic collectivism. So atomized individualism is the sort of rugged individualism, I am a man on an island and, I'm subject to no law except the law of myself, right? Pantheistic collectivism is you're part of an organism and you're sort of just a cell in an organism. But the terms that the church would use is that you're a member of a body. Meaning there is a heart, there is a command center, there is a brain, there is a soul, and you are a particular limb, which is distinct from the other ones, but you're part of that body, and therefore doing things against yourself actually harms everybody else. This is why when people will say, when they advocate for something like assisted suicide or whatever, it's not a big deal if somebody's not hurting themselves. No, it's hurting everybody. First of all, it's hurting them, and they're a part of the body. And when you attack parts of the body, if you hurt your index finger, okay, then maybe you'll be okay, but you'll be a little bit disabled as a body because you'll have no more finger. If you take off the whole hand, it's even worse. If you take off the whole arm, blah, 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 and you go to the point where you just kill the thing. But you start to disable the thing the more that you go after the individual parts. This is why we would say we're members of a body. We're not cells in an organism, and we're not completely self-constituted, self-sufficient individual bodies with no relation to the others, but we're parts of the same body. And this is the language of the scriptures. This is the language of the scriptures. And this is why the church has always said that, for example, there is right to things like capital punishment because, as St. Paul says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If there's an aspect of the body that is making disease on the rest, then it must be removed for the continuation of the body itself. This is why, you can argue for things like deportation or immigration rules or censorship of things taught in schools and so forth when they're against the nature of the body because they'll disease the thing and kill the thing. I've said this many times in other places. I don't know if I've said it on this series, but one of the great pitfalls of modern political discourse is that conservatives are basically classic liberals. When you go through these things, you realize, the conservatives are basically the ones appealing to rights. And that seems conservative in comparison to the Marxists, who are just completely wacko. But this is why the Marxists keep winning. Because the Marxists are under no illusions that you have rights. Because again, many of the rights that are trumpeted by conservatives, which are classic liberals, they're correct because it's a mix, it's a melange. You do obviously have certain liberties that are based on duties, as I said, but they view everything that you can do as a right, which is the problem. So it's like 50-50 or whatever the ratio would be. So there's lots of things that are correct. This is why Republican politics, or in Canada, conservative politics, etc., although there are issues with it, there's a reason why it speaks to you so much more than liberal politics. One of the things that the conservatives and the Republicans are really good at is that they do recognize the necessary inequalities, for sure. This is why they'll be against egalitarianism and say it should be based on merit and so forth, which is true in the public sense in many cases, of course. But the problem is that the left understands true Catholic social principles better than the right. They just invert them and pervert them. That's why they're more effective. Everything that I've said is completely consistent. Not that I've said, but Archbishop Lefebvre has shown us through the teachings of the church. Everything that we've talked about here that is consistent with Catholic social principles is completely, it completely justifies constraint, restriction, exclusion, excommunication, cutting off, deportation, censorship, and so forth, but for the good of for the rights of God. The left takes all of those mechanisms and does it for the rights of man. This is why this J.D. Vance fellow, I know he's not perfect, but one of the things that he's fascinating that he said, as you said, conservatives are so concerned with dismantling all of the liberal institutions. The problem is all these institutions, they're destroying our schools and so forth, so we should get rid of them. Okay, fair enough. But he said, I'm sorry, but why don't we just take over the institutions? And in a sense, he's actually correct. The reason why you have communist schools is because of liberalism. So yes, if you get rid of the public school system, let's say in some hypothetical fantasy, fine, you stop the modernist Marxist indoctrination of your children in the explicit, present, actual sense. But then that liberalism will eventually lead to another communism because it's the same fundamental principles that lead to communism, i.e. the sort of unrestrained freedom of the individual to be equal to all and blah, 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 blah. Instead, J.D. Vance is saying, actually, we have a public school system and the Marxists have used it to turn everyone into Marxists. We should just co-opt that system and teach them that Marxism is evil and teach them everything that has been taught them is evil. Quite frankly, he's correct in the sense that that'd be much more effective. This is not to advocate for everything J.D. Vance says. I know he's been bad on certain things. I'm just saying it's interesting to see this. This is something that, quite frankly, I'm kind of happy about, is that amongst the sort of new right in conservative politics, again, it's not perfect, but there is this growing awareness that this sort of liberalism of the founding of our nations was the Trojan horse for communism, and they're saying, to heck with that. The communists have it right, but they're just they're just inverse. They're just reverse, right? And you see this with communist societies. They get rid of the rights of the church, and the only thing that exists is the rights of the state. You're not allowed to worship God, so you have to worship Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-il or whatever. The story is old as time. So the trick is not to say, let's get rid of all the things that have been used for evil. The trick is to say, what have they been using for evil? Oh, they've been using education for evil? Well, let's not get rid of education as such, as a system. Instead, let's turn it into non-communist education. They've been using the public health authority to make people obese and vaccinated or whatever against their will. Let's use that infrastructure to make people healthy. That sort of thing. And this is a little simplistic because, of course, again, we should have conversations, and conversations have to be had about the size of these organizations and whether or not there's an inherent moral hazard with the level of authority and power. I get that. I'm just saying the logic is actually quite sound in the sense that it's not that there are institutions that are in charge of our lives necessarily. It's that they've been co-opted by evil people, and therefore we must take them back and use them against the devil. It's kind of like, I get a lot of heat, for example, from I get heat from sedevacantists and modernists. The modernists believe I'm a schismatic because I'm not a modernist. The Sedevacantists believe I'm a schismatic because I follow what they think is an anti-pope. So, but here I am as a supporter of the SSPX saying, this was basically Archbishop Lefebvre's prudential decision. Well, cutting ourselves off from the church entirely obviously has a danger to the schism and so forth. Even if there is logic to the Sedevacantist position in that there have been various great canonists and theologians historically who have said, if you deny the validity of a certain pope because you're confused about his election or so forth, you're not a schismatic. That's actually been established by many great saints and theologians. Fine. Although that logic is more about elections themselves, not about papal heresy. So it's not a perfect explanation for Sedevacantism, but there's a logic to it. But truth is not found in the mean, virtue is found in the mean. So there's a virtue in prudence. Prudence is a virtue. So the prudential perspective of Archbishop Lefebvre is, well, going with whatever the modernist authorities say is unvirtuous because it's going to be a sin against faith. Going with whatever the Sedevacantists say, even though they have many strong points, is going to be a sin against prudence because there's no solution to it. Taking this sort of middle ground in the sense of it being, we recognize that there's a danger in faith. We also recognize there's a danger in isolation. We don't have the solution per se, but the solution can't be either of those. I get a lot of heat for taking that position, but that's why I take it. Because, I'm sorry, but the church is the institution established by Jesus Christ. It is the institution established by our Lord, and it will last to the end of time. It may take different sort of visible forms in the sense of, it'll take different forms in the sense that, there can be good times and bad times and different departments and dicasteries, or like there can be sort of human elements that change. But the fact is the visible church will remain till the end of time. And the most effective way to restore the church is what you should want to do as a Catholic. You shouldn't want to just be, me and my independent priest sitting in a corner waiting for the end times. There's a spiritual danger in that. There is this sort of golden mean you're going to have to find between complete isolation and sort of a type of individualism and this blind collectivism, which is a sin against the faith because it makes you deny your reason. And this is really the position of Archbishop Lefebvre is. We know we can't exist without the church in the true sense, but at the same time, with the authorities of the church as they stand today, they destroy religion. So what are we going to do? Well, it's kind of like this. We don't believe in divorce as Catholics, but we do believe in separation in times of abuse. So someone who has to separate from an abusive husband is not denying the sacredness of marriage, but is in fact acknowledging it. They would be denying the sacredness of marriage by getting divorced, but by just remaining separate for a reason of survival for those under their care and persisting in a state that is not ideal, they're recognizing reality and handling their responsibilities in a situation that is imperfect, and they do not believe they can change the nature of the sacraments. That's kind of the position of the SSPX. All right, coming on an hour here. So fun going through this. I'm so happy we get to do this. Thank you for everyone who signed up. And if you've just signed up to hear this whole thing or listen to this, watch this whole thing because you were a free subscriber and you kind of want to see what I was saying, thank you. And there'll be more of these at least once a week until we get through the book. And that's all I have for you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Mere Tradition, another study of the book Have Uncrowned Him by Archbishop Lefebvre, and I will see you very soon. God bless you all.